Arcade light gun shooters like the House of the Dead are a novelty on consoles. Outside of arcades, the on-rail shooter genre only saw a couple of games released during the motion control era. Consoles like the Wii were a perfect fit with the Wii motion controller and sensor bar that replicated the arcade experience at home. Games like Resident Evil, The Umbrella Chronicles, and the House of the Dead Overkill offered many ways to shoot enemies with pinpoint accuracy thanks to the Wii's innovative controls. Although the Nintendo Switch still supports motion controls, not many developers have taken advantage of the feature to make a full-on arcade-styled action shooter. Enter The House of the Dead Remake, a modern recreation of the arcade classic by Sega. Initially released exclusively for the Switch, the game uses the Joy-Con's motion controls to replicate the light gun action from the arcade in a ravenous remake of the Curien Mansion incident for a new and returning audience.
Help! Everyone getting killed!
The House of the Dead was originally developed by Sega and released in Japanese arcades in 1996. While there were other light gun games in arcades like Sega's own Virtual Cop, the House of the Dead stood out because of its horror atmosphere and fast-paced gameplay. If you've ever played it in person, you know exactly what I mean. It's easy to pick up the light gun controllers and shoot at the screen to take out enemies, but making it through the game does take a good shot and a couple of credits. Part of what made it such a standout game was because of how accurate it felt to pull the trigger and see enemies on the screen react to your shots. It also helped that it had a great soundtrack. The House of the Dead featured an upbeat soundtrack that matched the horror atmosphere of the game. Together with the cheesy dialogue and gory graphics, it gave the game a lot of charm that made it popular in arcades around the world. Sega followed up with the more well-known sequel, The House of the Dead 2 in 1998. They continued to release the House of the Dead games with a third entry in 2003, a fourth in 2005, and the House of the Dead Scarlet Dawn in 2018. However, with the continued decline of arcades around the world getting so bad that even Sega exited the arcade business themselves, the series hasn't seen the same amount of popularity since the second game. The first game isn't even available on modern consoles and hasn't seen a home release since 1998. Outside of arcades or emulation, the game was inaccessible to a wider audience, but thanks to the remake, there's renewed interest in the series.
Now, the only way to make it back alive is to send them all back to the House of the Dead.
Now, looking at the game, we're introduced to AMS agents Thomas, Rogan, and G as they arrive at the Curien Mansion after receiving a call from Rogan's fiancée. Once there, they find it's overrun by Curien's experiments and have to make their way through the House of the Dead. As an on-rail shooter, the game moves while the player focuses on shooting enemies and objects in the environment. One thing that makes it stand out from other games in the genre is the branching paths. Certain actions like saving the scientists, shooting specific enemies, or doors can lead the player on a different path. Other actions like failing to save the scientists can also change the way you play a chapter. When replaying the game, you can see how the paths connect as you make your way through each enemy and boss lurking throughout the mysterious mansion. Bringing an arcade game made around the light gun controllers onto consoles was no easy task. The remake does a good job of reintroducing an arcade classic to modern consoles, but there are some concerns. Looking at reviews, reception has been mixed, with some people loving it and others unsatisfied for namely 3 reasons. The first reason is the graphics. The original game was made for arcades, and when released on the Sega Saturn, it had a graphical downgrade. The remake manages to keep the essence of the original with new graphics and the same old cheesy dialogue. It's not the best looking game on the Switch, but it's still the best that the House of the Dead 1 has ever looked on a console. The original game today isn't the best looking game either, but it does have its place. Unfortunately, there's no way to re-release the original game. Sega lost the source code, meaning it had to be remade from scratch. That's why they chose to remake the game instead, and why the original is not available as an unlockable.
You must stop, Curien, or else something terrible will happen.
Sophie!
The second reason is the aim. In a game where every shot counts, aiming and shooting has to be on point, otherwise it feels off and can distract from the experience. The main draw for the arcade game was the light gun controllers. Anyone could pick up the controller and shoot without much else to it. The remake has no traditional light gun, but offers a few different ways to play. Players can pick between using the Joy-Con controllers, which feel the closest to a light gun, the Pro controller, and even handheld mode. Aiming uses the thumbsticks or gyro, which isn't too bad, but can feel off at times because the crosshair drifts whenever you aim or shoot. There are a few settings to help with the aim, but it still has to be constantly recalibrated. Some people had a better time with the Pro controller, but personally I primarily played with the Joy-Cons. The aim isn't pinpoint perfect, but when it works, it works. And now that the game is on PC, there's also the option of using a mouse to point and shoot.
We won't let you have it your way, Curien.
The third reason is the game's length and lack of content. The House of the Dead, like many arcade games, was never a long game, but did offer a lot of replayability with different endings and high scores. It's a shot-for-shot remake of the original game, so everything found in the arcade version is in the remake. However, there was additional content made for the port, which included boss mode and selectable characters. This didn't make it into the remake, but other content was made for it, like the gallery, the armory, and in-game achievements. There is a new mode, Horde mode, which is the same story and scenarios, but features 15 times the amount of zombies. Although it's more of the same, it's a perfect playground to test out the unlockable weapons, like the automatic assault rifle or grenade launcher. It does lack other features like online multiplayer or leaderboards, which are limited to local only. It might not be the full arcade experience without the light guns, but you get what you pay for, and what you get is a remake of an arcade classic brought home.
Until now, if you wanted real arcade games, you had to go to the arcades. Now you don't.
Hey yo, $5.
Sega Genesis has changed all that, with games that look, play, and sound like the real arcade games, because they are the real arcade games.
It's been over 25 years since the release of the House of the Dead in Japanese arcades, and there still isn't a way to play the original game without finding an arcade that has it. While there are a few arcades around the world that specialize in retro games, it's a rarity to find one in person, depending on your location. The only home releases of the first game were downgraded, and now without the source code, there's no way to re-release the original game. The rest of the series, specifically the second, third, and fourth games, have all seen home releases on the Wii and PS3. The fifth game, Scarlet Dawn, is hard to come by outside of Japan, unless you have a Dave & Buster's nearby. The remake might not be the best way to play the House of the Dead, but it's the most accessible way to play it. Considering the fact that the original game is credited with popularizing zombies and is practically lost outside of arcades, it's great to visit or revisit the House of the Dead again. Some of the developers behind the remake grew up with Sega games and wanted to bring this iconic series back from the dead. They've already confirmed that they're working on a remake to the House of the Dead 2, and as the most popular title in the series, it's definitely going to have more eyes on it. Now that the remake is available on all major platforms like PlayStation and PC, there's a bigger audience for the series. There's no doubt that the reception for the first remake is going to affect the second game. If they listen to the feedback and apply it to the second remake, it could really be a horrific return of the House of the Dead.
Guess everything's over.
I guess so.